I signed the salt accord with my own seal, pressed the wax flat with the back of the ring my mother left me, and handed it across the table to a merchant who did not ask a single question about which alpha stood behind my name. 2 years ago, my name meant nothing in a room like that. It meant less than nothing. It meant a healer's assistant with no pack, no title, and no dowry worth mentioning at a lunar assembly. That same merchant, before he left, mentioned almost as an afterthought that 2 more High Valley packs had gone quiet that season, absorbed rather than asked, and that the families who'd slipped out ahead of it had come through my gate looking for work. I'd taken in 11 of them myself over the past 2 months. I filed that number away, the way I file everything, without yet knowing how soon I'd need it. That was the moment a boy came sprinting into the granary, out of breath, saying the Iron King's banner had been spotted on the eastern road. I finished the sentence I was writing. A half-finished sentence is worse than no sentence at all, and I have never once let a king interrupt my ink before it dried. "Has anyone watered his horses?" I asked. The boy blinked at me as if I'd asked him to recite scripture backward. Nobody ever considers it when a crown is involved, but horses don't care whose crown it is. I walked out into the yard myself. Garin Vale, Alpha King of the Iron Reach, sat his horse beneath my hawthorn tree with about 40 riders behind him, and I noticed, before I noticed anything else about him, that his mount favored its front left leg, and that whoever had planted his banner pole in the ground had done it wrong, leaning it a full hand's width off true. I did not collapse. I did not forget how to breathe. I have accounts to keep and a town to run, and neither of those things pauses for old feelings, however loudly they might knock. "You may dismount," I told him. "Your men can water their horses at the trough by the stable. We'll talk after the noon meal." Heartsmere doesn't interrupt its people's dinner for anyone, crowned or otherwise. I added that nobody was to touch the hawthorn. Then I turned and went back to my ledgers, and to his credit, he did not correct me or argue, which I noted, and did not examine too closely. I slept beneath that tree my first night at the Greywater Ford, when Heartsmere was nothing but 2 saddlebags, a ledger, my mother's seal ring, and coin enough for perhaps 3 weeks. I carved a small notch into its bark that first morning, proof, later, that I had started something rather than simply run from something else. 2 years of healing had turned that notch into the shape of a closed eye. I rest my hand there most mornings while I walk the boundary, and I do not let people touch it without asking. Garin, when he came to my granary loft alone that afternoon, did not touch the tree. He looked at the long table, the ledgers stacked 3 years deep, the wax, the seal press, the worn chair. "You built this," he said. "I continue building it," I said. "There's a difference. Finished things stop needing anyone." He told me why he'd come. Jarl Severin Voss, Alpha of the High Valleys, had spent 2 years absorbing smaller packs one by one, and now controlled enough territory that nearly every wagon of grain, salt, cattle, iron ore, and military supply, bound for the Iron Reach, had to cross my ford to reach him at all. Garin needed my signature on an exclusive military writ. It would grant Iron troops sole use of the crossing, deny Voss access entirely, and bind Heartsmere formally to his war. "No," I said. "Neutrality isn't a bargaining position for this town," I told him. "It's the entire reason it exists. Half my residents came here because some alpha or another decided their lives were worth less than a treaty. If I sign your writ, Heartsmere becomes a military target for 1 crown and a small pack waiting to be swallowed by whichever crown wins. I'll carry your wounded and your sick. I will not carry your war." He accepted the refusal, which surprised me more than I let on. 3 days later, Severin Voss arrived under a truce banner, and before he asked for so much as a cup of water, he rode straight to my hawthorn and rested his gloved hand exactly where mine usually sits. He smiled while he did it, a small, precise smile that told me he understood perfectly well what that mark meant to me, and had chosen to touch it anyway. Voss was not the sort of man who raised his voice. He was worse than that. He was the sort of man who made violence sound like paperwork. In my long hall that evening, in front of the full town council and Garin's riders, Voss produced an old border statute and read it aloud with the calm patience of a man who already knew he'd won. Unclaimed marchland, the law said, belonged to the nearest recognized alpha, unless the settlement upon it held a valid sovereign charter, and a charter, by the same old rules, could only be entered by an alpha sponsor. No packless steward had ever been permitted to file one alone, which was precisely why I never had. I'd known that gap existed since my first year here. I had simply gambled that no one powerful enough to exploit it would ever bother looking this far into the marches. Hartsmere sat on marchland. I was, by every legal definition, packless. By the letter of that old, ugly law, Hartsmere already belonged to him. He was careful to say he wasn't conquering anything. He was simply correcting a clerical oversight. He even offered, generously, to let me continue as steward under his authority, if I submitted quietly. Garin rose before I could speak. "The writ exists," he said. "I recognized Hartsmere the day Ellowen Hart raised its first wall 2 years ago. The record sits in the iron rolls, under my own hand." He turned to his second. "Ronan, ride for it." I knew, standing right beside him, that there was no such writ. Voss studied Garin for a long moment, smiled again, and withdrew for the evening, unbothered. I found Garin alone by the hawthorn, afterward. "There is no writ," I said. "No," he admitted. "Not yet. I intend to have one drawn and entered into the rolls before Voss can verify the claim." "Why?" I asked. "Because I will not watch him take your life away from you a second time," he said. 2 days later, Ronan Ash came to my loft himself, and I could tell before he said a word that something in him had already turned against the errand he'd been sent on. "I drafted what the king asked for," he said, laying the writ on my table. "I also brought this. He doesn't know I'm showing it to you yet. I think he means to, eventually. I don't trust eventually where you're concerned, and frankly, neither should you." He set down a second, older page, pulled from the royal rolls. Garin's betrothal record from 2 years earlier. Lady Aurelia Voss's name sat on the official line, in a clerk's formal hand. My own name sat in the margin beside it, in Garin's handwriting, small and cramped, as if he'd been trying to fit it somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. Beneath both names was a short private note, unsigned, explaining that Severin Voss had controlled the undefended Greywater villages at the time and had threatened to burn them and kill me personally if Garin refused to publicly choose Aurelia instead. "Why bring me this yourself?" I asked Ronan, instead of letting him decide when I was ready to know it. "Because I watched 2 years of a king who stopped eating properly and started forgetting meetings over a woman he claimed never to think about," Ronan said. "I don't serve him well by protecting him from the truth catching up. I serve him by making sure it catches up honestly." I sat with that page for a long time before I went looking for Garin. I found him near the stable and put the page down on the fence rail between us. "You let me believe I was unwanted," I said, "that my name meant nothing." 2 years, Garin. "I would make the same choice again," he said, "if the only alternatives were your hatred or your death. I won't apologize for choosing you alive." "That's not what I asked you to apologize for," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "The choice I'd make again," he admitted. The silence afterward wasn't only strategy. It was fear, too. Guilt. Pride, if I'm honest, and plain cowardice under all of it. I decided what truth you could carry without ever once asking you. That part I have no defense for. He explained that Aurelia had never shared a true bond with him. The union had been political, built entirely under her father's threats, and never completed beyond the paperwork. She had known from the beginning his wolf had chosen someone else, and had spent 2 years quietly gathering evidence against her own father. 2 days after that, Aurelia herself rode into Hartsmere alone, under a plain gray cloak, no banner, no guard she trusted enough to bring. "I wanted to say this to your face instead of leaving it to him," she told me, standing in my granary doorway. "He silenced your name because my father held a knife to it. My father silenced my choices because I was born useful to him. We were both spent by the same man, in different currencies, and I am tired of being the reason people assume I resent you. I don't. I resent the man who built a world where either of us had to be used at all. "What do you need from me?" I asked her. "Nothing yet," she said. "Later, testimony and a charter that doesn't run through my father's law or your king's mercy. I came because I thought you deserved to hear it from me, not filtered through him." I believed her. I still do. A name kept in a margin, I told Garen afterward, cannot live the life its owner was denied. If you want any future with me, the truth doesn't get to stay folded into a betrothal record. You dissolve the political marriage, legally, in the open. You protect Aurelia's independence, because it's owed, not gifted. You confess the false writ, publicly, whatever it costs you. You recognize Heir without claiming it as yours to recognize. And you accept whatever your own counsel decides to do with you afterward, without asking me to soften it for you. Agreed, he said. We did not have time to resolve any of it properly before the next trouble arrived. Within days, I had reports of pitch barrels purchased upriver, axes gone missing from 2 nearby settlements, and the gray water running low enough for an easy night crossing. Voss's visible camp sat perfectly still, which worried me more than movement would have. His hand on my hawthorn had never been affection. It had been a warning, precise and deliberate. I predicted he meant to burn the hawthorn, break the bridge, terrify the town in darkness, and leave Heartsmere as a lesson to every other free settlement watching. I led the preparations myself. I moved Garen's 40 riders into the willows, out of sight. I reviewed the bell signals with every household. I moved children and elders into the stone granary. I organized water teams, wrapped the bridge timbers in wet hides, and set wagons as barriers across the 2 secondary roads. I posted a rider at the hawthorn itself, since it stood directly beside the bell tower and the granary path, close enough to the town's actual nerve center that losing it would cost us more than a symbol. Garen followed my plan without trying to rewrite it. I smelled the pitch before I heard the first axe strike wood. I rang the deep bell 3 times, and Heartsmere moved exactly the way we had drilled it to. The bridge held longer than Voss's men expected, green oak resisting the fire better than dry pine would have. But partway through, our second bell signal, meant to call the water teams to the granary side, went silent, cut by someone who'd slipped past the willows and cut the rope before we ever heard the axe that did it. For several long minutes, half my water teams were running blind, guessing which fire to answer first. I reached the hawthorn myself when the rider I'd posted there went down under a blow I never saw coming and found Voss's torchbearer already reaching for the lowest dry branch. I do not remember every detail with perfect clarity. A lantern hook in my hand, my fingers closing hard around a stranger's wrist until the torch dropped into the dirt instead of the branches above us. A long burn opening across my forearm where it came too close before that. My blood landed across the pale seam in the bark, over that old closed-eye scar, like a signature I hadn't planned on writing. Garen saw me hurt from across the yard, and I watched something in him strain hard against its own leash. He did not abandon the larger plan for it. He ordered Ronan to secure the civilians and hold the bridge, sent 2 riders to restring the cut bell rope so the water teams could regroup, and only then turned to the fight in front of him. It ended with Voss caught, at the edge of the ford himself, trying to slip away in the confusion like any other man who'd gambled and lost. Before dawn, in the gray light over the yard, Garen spoke publicly, in front of Heartsmere's residents, his own riders, the town council, and Voss himself, bound and silent for once in his life. Garen admitted that Voss had blackmailed him 2 years earlier, that he had let me believe he'd rejected me freely, that the writ he'd claimed existed in the rolls had never existed at all, and that forging one, however just the cause, had still been a crime against his own council's trust. Then he said Heartsmere did not belong to the Iron Crown, did not belong to Voss, and existed because I had built it, and its people chose, every day, to keep maintaining it. He withdrew any claim beneath the old marshland law. He withdrew the demand for exclusive military use of the ford. Grain would cross only under terms Heartsmere itself accepted. He also announced, before I ever had to ask, that his council had reviewed the false writ that same week and formally censured him for it. stripped him of the authority to issue emergency land writs without council approval for the next full year, and placed the royal rolls under independent audit, with Ronan Ash named as the record's outside keeper, answerable to the council rather than the crown alone. A king publicly surrendering claims and publicly accepting punishment for the ones he'd invented is rarer, in my experience, than a king publicly making claims at all. Voss stood trial before a border tribunal on charges of blackmail, threats against civilians, attempted arson, illegal seizure, hired violence, and the forced absorption of smaller packs. Every pack he'd swallowed was given the chance to testify. Aurelia's evidence helped seal the case, and in exchange won her full legal independence and control of her own inheritance. The false writ was burned in my own hearth, and a new charter was negotiated openly in its place, signed by myself, by Heartsmere's council, by the Iron Reach, by the river merchants who depended on the ford, by the packs Voss had swallowed, and Garin helped restore, and by Aurelia, representing a High Valleys finally free of her father's hand. That charter guarantees Heartsmere's neutrality, independent control of the ford, protection for every packless resident who walks through our gate, no forced alpha claim over the land, council-elected leadership, consent required for any military passage, guest right for refugees, and a mixed tribunal for trade disputes. My name sits at the top of that charter as a principal signatory, not folded into a margin. Garin did not ask me to leave Heartsmere for him, not once. He started visiting properly instead. He sent word before he arrived. He watered his own horses without being told. He waited through the noon meal like everyone else. He never touched the hawthorn without asking first, and he accepted every political refusal I gave him afterward. I did not enter courtship with him until Heartsmere's independence was written in ink no one could later erase, until Aurelia was fully free, until the political marriage was legally dissolved, until the false writ had been confessed rather than buried, and until his council's sanction had actually been carried out rather than promised. Our first kiss happened beside the hawthorn. After all of that, my arm was still bandaged. I rested my hand on the pale seam, over the place my own blood had marked it during the fire. He asked before setting his hand down beside mine. It felt less like a beginning than like the completion of a sentence that had been sitting half-finished for 2 years, waiting for someone patient enough to come back and close it properly. A year has passed since that night. Heartsmere is still free. Grain still crosses the ford. Only under terms we right ourselves. I am still warden. Garin visits more often than a king probably should, by his own council's dry estimation. Aurelia is building an independent council of her own in the High Valleys, and the smaller packs Voss once swallowed are slowly regaining their footing. A new traveler came through the gate again this morning, carrying everything she owned in 2 worn bags, looking at our stone granary the way I once looked at nothing but a shallow river crossing and an old hawthorn tree. "Have the horses been watered?" I asked her guide, out of habit now more than anything. They hadn't been. Of course, nobody ever thinks of it first. I looked over her debts, her skills, whether she needed a healer, and then I offered her bread, the way Heartsmere has always offered bread first and questions after. I used to believe my name carried no real weight, simply because one alpha failed to speak it before his own court when it would have cost him something to say it. A name gathers its weight from the promises its owner actually keeps, not from who is standing beside it when it's spoken. The truer thing is that I no longer need a king to prove that for me. Was Garin right to protect Elowen with a lie, or did 2 years of silence cross a line he had no right to cross? Tell us what you think in the comments.